We're going to begin. I would like to welcome to the stage, ready? I'd like to welcome to the stage a man you just heard from, Dr. Stephen Hicks. If we could all welcome him back to the stage. You just heard from him, so I'll refrain from repeating his biography and instead just mention very quickly a little bit more about Stephen's work here at the Atlas Society. During his tenure with us here, he has presented in the past bi-weekly sessions called Atlas Intellectual Sessions. Some of you may remember them. His courses are still up on the Atlas Society website. They are a wonderful trove of information and knowledge on topics like capitalism, anti-capitalism, postmodernism, philosophies of education. So I encourage you to go to atlassociety.org, and under the Atlas University tab on the top of our website, you will find his Atlas Intellectual Sessions. And without further ado, I want to turn the mic over to him for the rise of woke, from postmodernism and critical theory to today's identity politics.
In my view, if we're going to make the case for doom, following up on the previous panel, current academics, subsectors, humanities, subsector, people dealing with abstract ideas is the thing that we should be most worried about. So we're all familiar with woke. Woke means a number of different things. There's lots of schools and so on. Some of them are a little more healthy than others. But woke as an applied activist movement of many of the trends that have been incubating in the academic world for the last 50 years, 60 years, depending on how you count. It is a malignant intellectual and activist force. And so what I want to do is just do a quick tour today of how we got to where we are, what some of the core operative ideas are. If you do the demographics of what's going on inside the intellectual activist world and so on, the three dominant, am I working here? Good. Where do I point this, by the way? Anywhere. There we are. Big words: race, class, and not quite anywhere, apparently. Sex. Right. Those are the big three. Dominating. If you just do the Google Ngram counts of journal articles published, of all of the things with respect to the human condition, the natural world, and so forth that we can and should be focused on, right? These are the three that are dominating, getting the most attention, and naturally then the students who are picking up these ideas and they want to make the world a different place, if not a better place. Those are the things that they are most focused on. Now, where did this particular subset of issues come to be dominant from, and what is the content? Of course, there are legitimate issues about race, sex, class, and so on. So we'll look at some data here. This is some wonderful data mining. David Rosado is a New Zealand data scientist. They can take all media that are published and then just do a word count. How often does a given word appear in New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, and so on. So this is the words racist, racists, racism. And what we have then is a timeline. So starting in 1970, of course, we've been interested in these issues for a long time. But then suddenly, 2012, 2013, 2014, huge spike. Suddenly, all of the major journalistic outlets, and this is just a sampling, are talking about this as an issue. And of course, we could have to say, well, either this is because in the culture, suddenly there's a huge amount more racism and racists that are going on, and the journalists are merely reporting what's going on in the culture. Or the other hypothesis is that we're into a new generation of professional journalists who have an agenda, and race and racism of a certain sort and with a certain agenda is what they are interested in talking about and pushing, and that's what we're starting to see. So what happened then in the lead up to training that generation of journalists and so forth? Now the same thing, if we look at issues of sex and sexism, 1970, some ups and downs, but again, exact same time period, 2012, 13, 14, 15, huge spike journalistically in discussion about sex, sexism, and often from a certain perspective. The issue of trans, same thing. Issue of white privilege. And we put all four of them together. So I'm having some issues with this guy. Yeah. I think there's a delay is what there is. Okay, good. So if we generalize then to issues of sex, race, and class, these are then the exact same trend line that is going on. So we're into a new cultural era, and that explains why when we go on our social media, watch the news, talk with people, these are the issues that are our focus. Now, putting this in context, while the negativity surrounding the way in which we are discussing those three sets of issues is predominant, nonetheless, we are in the context where if we just focus on the issues of class, which is largely issues of poverty, we've never had it so good. We've gone from a time period where 2-3 centuries ago, 90% of the world's population lived in poverty, and more importantly, the vast majority of people believed that poverty was a natural or divinely ordained fact of human condition that was not going to be solved. To a time where perhaps, if you keep your measures of poverty constant, less than 10% of the world's population is living in extreme poverty. And correspondingly, we've had a mindset shift where we actually believe poverty can be solved. And if there is poverty, real poverty, we are shocked by it, and we are wondering why this problem hasn't been solved. So we have largely solved the problem, and we believe that the problem is a solvable problem, but nonetheless, from the academic world that is driving much of the public policy discussion, we would get the impression that it's worse and worse and not being solved at all. Here's some more data here on the extreme poverty. This is now going back 2 centuries, early in the age of Enlightenment, post-industrial revolution, but they're 90% of the world population living in extreme poverty, and that's usually defined as just a few dollars a day, and then steady progress over the course of the last 2 years, so 2 centuries rather, to now, then this is still 8-9-year-old data, a small percentage. On the issues of sexism, and there of course is sexism, and sexism has been a terrible problem, right, historically, but all of the trend lines with respect to women getting an education, being able to have their own bank accounts, being able to move freely about the world, being able to go into pretty much any profession that they want as trends. Women have never had it right so good. Nonetheless, from academic quarters, when we talk about feminists, and there's lots of different schools of feminism, but the center of gravity of most of them is times are worse than they have ever been, and things are problematic. On issues of racism, and the closely related issue of slavery, again, huge progress on this issue. 3 centuries ago, right, people didn't particularly have a problem with slavery. It was, again, a natural or a divinely ordained fact about the human condition, but we've made huge progress in getting rid of slavery, relegating it to the less civilized parts of the world, sending it underground, and correspondingly attitudes with respect to racism, a significant improvement there. So what we have then is an academic subculture that's been enormously influential in spilling out into the more general culture with certain views of those 3 things that fly in the face of the philosophical and actually material progress that we've made on all of those issues. So the question is why this has happened. Now, the big word for the last 40, 50 years has been postmodernism. And what we find is people on the far left and now increasingly on the far right are targeting the Enlightenment. So I think the foil has to be making sure that we're clear on what the modernists and the advocates of the Enlightenment did in fact accomplish. This is a chart from one of my books. And there's a long historical story and a long important philosophical story, and all of these are revolutionary moments in human history. How much was accomplished intellectually and practically? If you go back to the early 1600s, standard philosophy textbooks say, here are the father of modern philosophy, Descartes, Bacon, Locke, and so forth. And they really were revolutionary in arguing that human reason is foundational and competent, right? And that it is widespread among the population. And this is against centuries and millennia of take things on faith, take things because they have been dictated by higher authority or they are written in an old book that has the imprimatur of God. but you do not think for yourself. You follow the elite, and the vast majority of people, according to that traditional view, are incompetent to think about those most important issues. To have all of that millennia of ways of thinking about thinking overturned in a relatively short period of time in the 1600s was in fact a philosophical revolution. And pretty much all of modernity follows from that. Once people become rational, we are encouraging people to become rational, then it becomes important to give them the freedom to think for themselves, the literacy and the other tools so that they can in fact think for themselves. And then we start to trust people to make their own decisions with respect to politics, and we get into the Democratic and Republican era. We think that people are competent to run their own economic lives, so we're going to have free market societies. We think people are competent to run their own religious lives, so we have widespread religious freedom and religious toleration. We think that we can figure out the way the world works, so science starts to take off, and then once we get all of that knowledge, we apply it in engineering, and the Industrial Revolution takes off. So this is an enormous amount of revolutionary transformations taking place in the world over the course of just a couple of centuries. The modern world, the most astonishingly revolutionary era ever in human history. And the Enlightenment is the age at which it became to intellectual maturity, where they partly recognized the significance of all of the philosophical revolutions that had occurred, put them together into a package, gave it a label, and then had the self-confidence that we can take all of these ideas and now forthrightly apply them to all aspects of life and society and make the world a better place. That's the Enlightenment. That's precisely what the postmodernists are attacking. So the two most famous names are French. As it turns out, I almost said French, of course, but that's a post reaction. So these are just cherry-picked quotations, of course, from Michel Foucault, the most famous of them. If you take all of social science literature for the last 100 years, the most cited works in social science literature, Michel Foucault has 2 of the top 10 books. He's just everywhere dominating humanities and social science life. Reason is the ultimate language of madness, and there's a typical postmodern double-edged point, but basically the distinction between the sane and the insane is an artificial construct, and we can break it down, and we are going to subvert reason. Reason and power are one and the same. It's not that we are rational and we are going to figure out standards of goodness and we care about justice. Rather, we have value agendas, the argument, and we want to increase our power on behalf of the values that we just subjectively hold, and reason really is just a matter of rationalizing the power or value agenda that we already have. So all of this Enlightenment language that reason is powerful, that it is competent, that everybody has it, that we can use reason in the service of justice to make the world a better place, all of that is replaced by an extraordinary cynicism on all levels philosophically. So again, we have another philosophical revolution. In more detail, commercial advertisement, by my book. Now the word woke, I see this as an applied word, because postmodernism is very broad, very abstract, very intellectualized. We started to talk about the politically correct, and those of you who are a little older will remember when we had the big debates over political correctness, and that was a transition phase where it was very clear that it was an anti-Enlightenment, anti-modernist agenda that was trying to be imposed upon many of us. But the politically correct label literally came out of the Marxist tradition, and many people who were opposed to free markets, capitalism, the modern world, and so forth, were at the same time trying to distance themselves from traditional Marxism. So we needed a new label. And so they drew on critical theory and some other movements that were going on to talk about false consciousness, which had also come out of Marxism, but someone who strips off the distorting lenses, strips off all of the false consciousness, strips off all of the conditioning that the capitalists have put on you, to see the world better more accurately from your group's perspective, that's an awakening moment. And so the woke initially was a self-description, but then it's also become a pejorative for people who are opposed to that. So what we find, though, in the mainstream of woke is that they are not interested in rational debate. This is cancel culture, right, all of the way down. Rather than participating in discussions and in welcoming discussions from a variety of perspectives, they are explicitly on the opposite of that. So the modern creation of liberal arts education and that ideal of we're going to expose students to all sorts of positions on all sorts of issues and have professors who disagree with each other, and the students will be exposed to all of that, but we're ultimately going to train the student to think for himself and increasingly herself and leave the student to make their own final judgment. All of that at the heart of liberal arts education, which really is a creation of the modern world, is under assault. We're not interested in doing that, and that's because rationality is set aside. What you find is the rise of identity politics, another aspect of the overall woke package. We don't really see people as individuals with their own agency. People are members of groups. And then finally, this idea that we're making progress, that the progress is being widely distributed, that it's open to all, that we're making the world basically for everyone better a place, is replaced by a cynical view that we are at each other's throats fundamentally, and if there is an apparent gain, that always must mean at the expense of someone else, and whoever that someone else is, we're on the side of that someone else. And the argument then is going to be also that we're not going to be able to solve these by the traditional liberal methods. We need to do various authoritarian methods. So as a descriptor of the animating premises of the woke movement, they are clearly coming out of intellectually the postmodern tradition, and they are opposed to the fundamental premises of modernism and the Enlightenment. Now, this is a big, sprawling, wide movement. I think one thing that's also interesting about postmodernism, as it stops simply being an intellectual movement and starts to guide strategy, is that it's not a strategic movement in the sense that most previous intellectual movements became strategic movements. Most previous movements had a doctrine. These are the things that we believe. These are our firm principles, and we will apply them in terms of a strategy. We need to do this, we need to do that. Once we've accomplished that, we will do this, that, and the other thing, and then we will reach our goal, whatever that is. Whether it's our religion, right, whether it's Enlightenment philosophy, or whatever it is. Postmodernism is, because of the nature of it, suspicious of any sort of unified strategy or any sort of unified view of the world. So what makes it particularly difficult to wrap our minds around is that it is, instead of a step-by-step strategy that is articulated clearly, that it is a more opportunistic movement. So if we think about old-style war, where there were the rules of war, and both sides knew what the rules of war were, and we would meet each other, and we would follow various rules and procedures and well-worked-out strategies, and then we would figure out who won and who lost. Postmodernism is much more like guerrilla warfare, where you don't have a strategy worked out. What you are simply doing, though, is looking for a weakness in your enemy, and any weakness, intellectual or cultural, that happens to emerge first, that's the thing that you will attack. And then you will see how well you do, and you'll do a number of hit and run attacks, and then when you get beaten back on that one, you come back and you look for a new weakness. So I'm just going to focus, since there's, cultures are extraordinarily complicated, on just one such strategy. One big strength, of course, of modern society has been its attitudes toward race and racism. We've been extraordinarily progressive on race and race issues over the last 2 centuries. Nonetheless, that comes packaged with a weakness that we are sensitive and often close to feeling ashamed and guilty about much of the history of race and racism in our own culture and the residual amounts of race and racism. So this is an area of opportunity for the postmoderns to attack. Attack people on race. They immediately go on the defensive, they get worried, they start to feel a little ashamed, they start to feel a little guilty. Those people are psychologically in a place where it's much easier to argue with them and attack. put people on the defensive. So I want to focus just on the race and racism issue and make the connections to woke and postmodernism. This, I think, though, is on the positive side, something that we should be celebrating and not be being defensive about. The idea that there was something wrong with racism, something wrong with slavery, is such a new idea in human history. Right? You talk to the anthropologists and they will say human beings have been around for 300,000 years or whatever the number is. So you take 300,000 years and you say, what's 10% of that? That's 30,000 years. What's 10%? That's 3,000 years. What's 10% of that? That's 300 years. So it's like 10% of 10% of 10%. It's a blink of an eye in human history, but it's not really until the 1600s, the 1700s, the first century of modernity and laying the groundwork for the idea that you find people, first time ever, saying there's something wrong with slavery. There's something wrong with racism and the easy assumption that people who look like me and behave like me are just automatically superior to people who don't look like me and who behave like me and my group. Now, part and parcel is that there's a philosophical groundwork that had been laid. We started in the early modern world to say we should really be seeing people as individuals and not just members of a certain class structure, a certain family structure, or a certain ethnic structure. Treat people as individuals. When you start to see people as individuals, then racism seems problematic. Once you start taking individuals seriously and say people, have their lives to live, right? You're not just here to serve society, serve the king, serve the church, serve for your tribe, right, whatever, but people have their own lives, then slavery starts to look very problematic, because that's a huge number of people who don't have their own lives to live. So you start to find increasing number of individuals saying both racism and slavery are morally problematic. They don't fit with our new, modern, more enlightened understanding of human history. Now, just a few voices initially. And then something significant starts to happen in the late 1700s. For the first time, again, ever in human history, you start to see the formation of societies. Those isolated individuals start to get together and say, maybe we should do something about this, form an activist society to start getting rid of slavery. The very first one in human history was founded in Pennsylvania. Benjamin Rush, Benjamin Franklin soon became the president of this association. 2 years after, there was a society for the abolition of slavery founded in England, and then more broadly in Britain. And then 1 year later, a society founded in France for the abolition of slavery. I'm dwelling on this point because this is the first time in human history, and it's just a few centuries ago that we have people saying, let's do something about this moral stain on the human condition. But still, vast numbers of people in the society don't have much problem with it. The dates, I think, also are important. This is the 1780s. Right? So this is 1776, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, Declaration of Independence, fighting for the new country. The French Revolution is about to start. And so all sorts of stuff is happening politically, economically in the 1770s and 1780s, and it's all part of a peace, a new kind of society we need to fight for, and an important part of that is getting rid of slavery, freeing all individuals so that they all equally have the same rights. And it's also the case that all three of these societies that first enacted anti-slavery movements were the nations where the Enlightenment ideals were the most strong. Britain, France, and the United States, when you look at the histories, they dominate. They are the places where a significant number of intellectuals are advocates of the new, modern Enlightenment philosophy. So this is an extraordinary accomplishment, and I think something that should be celebrated. So here's William Wilberforce, 1789. Skipped right over Diderot, just as an example. There he is. So kind of a representative American, a representative British individual, a representative Frenchman, right, arguing on moral grounds that slavery is wrong and we ought to do something about that. Now, by the time we get into the 1840s, there's all sorts of legislations that have started to occur. So we go from a bunch of individuals to a certain number of groups that are now associated. Cultural education, so people start to change their attitudes. Textbooks are rewritten. Educational opportunities are afforded to individuals who are slaves or recently were slaves. They are allowed to increasingly to form their own churches, to keep family units intact. There's legislation to say we're not going to import slaves anymore. We're going to say, all right, we can't do very much about the current generation of slaves, but anybody who is born of a slave is automatically going to be a free citizen. So there are dozens and dozens of legislative and cultural activities that are going on late 1700s, early 1800s. And then it starts to spill out into active war. So after, what does that mean? Was that for me? No, okay. I still have some minutes here, so I'm going to go with those, right? The British get a huge amount of credit here because after they dealt with Napoleon, they had the biggest navy in the world, devoted huge resources to stopping the international slave trade across the oceans, both on the Atlantic side and the Indian Ocean side. Great kudos there. International treaty, Emancipation Proclamation, we're familiar with that one here. Civil War largely fought over the issue of slavery. And then the trend lines show something like this from 1750. And this is shocking for us to think about. That as little as 2.5 to 3 centuries ago, over 90% of the world's population was either a slave or a serf. Stunning. Right? And that's the way it had been for much of human history. Right? So to go to now, where it's a tiny percentage, and we by and large know what parts of the world, right? It's the unenlightened, unmodernized parts of the world where most of the remaining slaves are. Rand and her philosophy of one of the Enlightenment philosophies par excellence, it makes perfectly good sense. If you think that human beings have reason, and that the glory of moral agency is exercising your reason and governing your own life, and that all human beings have this capacity, and that individual right to live your life by your own judgment is morally fundamental. Racism is just a huge slap in the face, right, against that, because it means the exact opposite of treating individuals as morally self-responsible agents. It says, well, some superficial thing over which you have no control and really does not govern anything with respect to the important value choices, character choices, and actions that you make, that I'm going to say this is the most important factor with respect to how I'm going to deal with you. That's an irrationality of a huge proportion. It's interesting that Rand wrote this in 1963, and the character judgment issue is highlighted there. Martin Luther King's famous phrase, also 1963. Obviously, Martin Luther King is not an objectivist, although there are significant overlaps there, but the issue of moral fundamentality, the content of your character is fundamental. That is an individual, self-agency, moral worth fundamental. That's what we should be judging on, not on the basis of superficiality. This becomes a widespread common point, and of course, we're all born into that generation. So, what happened? Now, there's other schools of dealing with racism, some of them more or less individualistic, some of them having religious connections, some of them arguing that, yes, by and large, we want to be individualistic, but maybe we need a little bit of collectivist affirmative action medicine for a generation or so to solve the remaining problems, and so on. In my final moments, though, I do want to focus on critical race theory, which is the new kid on the block, and it is coming directly out of a combination of postmodernism and critical theory, which are two very closely related movements. So just to give you some talking points on this issue as well. And so here is, Richard Delgado. He is widely recognized as one of the co-founders, the 3 or 4 most important names founding critical race theory and its approach to race theory. So here's from a book, a handbook on critical race theory that was published. And notice the date, 1995. This is when the academic groundwork for critical race theory is being laid. Postmodernism as more abstract theory, 1960s, 1970s. By the time we get to the 80s and 90s, we have a whole school of academics who have been trained as postmoderns and closely related movements who are now interested in taking the high theory and applying it to different cultural sectors, race being one of those cultural sectors. So here's Delgado, law professor. Unlike traditional civil rights, so what he means exactly right there is Martin Luther King Jr. as traditional civil rights. And so we're signaling, we are rejecting the Martin Luther King approach, which embraces incrementalism and step-by-step progress. So that the way we need to do is step-by-step, as we've been doing for the last 2 centuries, eliminating racial double standards and so forth, and that we are making progress. We are rejecting that approach in its entirety. Critical race theory questions, that's academic speak for saying rejects, right? The very foundations of the liberal order. Right? So whatever you take the liberal order to mean philosophically, and we all know what that means, right? We are rejecting the foundations of the liberal order. That is to say, we are rejecting the Enlightenment, we are rejecting rather the entire modern project, including equality theory, the idea that all people are going to be equal with respect to their rights and perhaps in terms of some outcomes as well. We're not about equality. Legal reasoning, notice that, we're rejecting legal reasoning, right? Evidence, logic, the idea that a jury of our peers can sort through a huge amount of conflicting testimony and arguments on both sides. That we are going to, in a stylized way, make sure that both sides get a chance to speak and to contradict each other. All of the apparatus of applied reasoning, we are rejecting that. The Enlightenment rationalism, well, there it is, right? And neutral principles of constitutional law. Right? So the very idea that we should not have any double standards in the law, that they should be neutral with respect to the parties, we are rejecting that. And so we know what the opposites of all of those things are going to be, right? So it's going to be unequal application. Right? It's not going to be a legally rational evidentiary process, due process, and so on. We're not going to be Enlightenment reasonable people about this, and we are not going to be neutral. We have our racial group, it has its agenda, it's in opposition to the other racial groups and their agendas, so it's going to be some sort of unenlightened process that is going to bring about the results. So that's Richard Delgado, there we are. Okay, death by PowerPoint, I won't read you this whole thing, but this is important. So this is Richard Delgado in the 1990s saying, well, where did this movement come from? And he's doing an interview now that he's a famous guy. And he says, I was a member of the founding conference that's up there, and I've got some things that are asterisked with the red that are down here. So it was a bunch of us law professors got together at this place. And he mentions Kimberly Crenshaw, and he says that for some reason the place where we were meeting, their offices were in a converted convent, right? So he was remarking on the irony. We're a bunch of atheists, but we're meeting in this conference, and he says, an odd place for a bunch of Marxists. So the self-description is we're a bunch of Marxist law professors getting together to found critical legal theory as a movement. And we're going to work out a set of principles. Again, Crenshaw is mentioned, Matsuda, Charles, Derek Bell, right, and so on. So I wanted to just follow up on what these asterisk point. So this is Richard Delgado. Another co-founder of the movement is Kimberly Crenshaw, law professor at Columbia University. And she also is reflecting on the same founding movement in the 1990s, where the academics come together, 35 law scholars, and it's going to be grounded in critical theory. And that's a term of art. We'll come right back to that one as well. Responsive to the realities of racial politics in America, indeed, the organization coined the term critical race theory to make it clear that our work locates itself at the intersection of critical theory and race. So what we're doing is taking critical theory, and there are a number of versions of that. There's critical race theory, critical environmental theory, critical feminist theory, and so on. But we're taking critical theory, whatever that is, and applying it to racial issues. And we also know that it's Marxists in law school who are interested in forming this new movement. So backing up, what is critical theory? And here we have to go back to two philosophy PhDs, and these are the guys who are the founders of critical theory. They are both German, Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno. They co-published a book in 1947 called Dialectic of Enlightenment, and the argument there is basically that the Enlightenment does not really lead to liberalism in a free society and a progressive society. Instead, the Enlightenment leads to Nazi Germany and it leads to Soviet Russia. So kind of the exact opposite of what you might expect. And so what we have, though, is two guys who were themselves Marxists. And I need to say just a little bit about their bio, just so we know. Max Horkheimer, some of you, I'm going to say this for the younger people especially, maybe you've not read a huge amount of Rand, but who is the philosopher Ayn Rand hates the most? There we go, bingo. All right. Horkheimer wrote his dissertation on Kant. Adorno, when he was a teenager and young, was in a precocious, really smart young guy in a reading group with a number of other leading intellectuals in Germany. And he talks about the transformative experience he had reading through Kant's Critique of Pure Reason in his teen years. Now, these are the two most famous critical theorists. There's also Herbert Marcuse, Walter Benjamin, and a few others. And what you will find is that all of them are Marxists politically, every single one. But they are recognizing by the time we get into the 20th century that classical Marxism has some problems and they want to repackage Marxism or do some modifications to keep the core spirit of Marxism, but find a new effective intellectual strategy for carrying on the fight against capitalism, liberalism, Western society in general. And this might sound flip, but the kind of arguments you have there, they don't all believe exactly what the others believe. Oops, I don't want to do that yet. But what you will find is that all of them will say Kantian epistemological philosophy and some portions of its moral philosophy are fundamental. Those are axiomatic. Marxist political philosophy and some of its cores are axiomatic. But then you will find some variation. Some will then argue it's Kant plus Marx, but we have to add some Hegel. And others will say, no, 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 you're all wrong. It's Kant plus Marx, plus we have to add some Nietzsche. Or that's wrong. It's Kant plus Marx plus Heidegger. That is the right mix. And this is the range of opinion inside the critical theory. Now, this is 1940s, 1950s. If you're reading in the 1960s, Herbert Marcuse, another Frankfurt School critical theory guy, becomes very prominent in America. And then they train a number of intellectuals who, by the time we get to the 1990s, Richard Delgado, critical race theory, Kimberlé Crenshaw. Then we fast forward 20 years, critical race theory as a movement, well established in the academic world, then spills out into journalism, it spills out into the broader culture, and we're all aware of the debates over critical race theory. Now, I don't want to end on a negative note, so I'm going to take just 2 minutes to say we really are making progress. And this is one of the things that we do need to worry about. Critical theory, critical race theory, but the postmodernism behind it, pay careful attention to it. But this is now data from about 10 years ago about if we really are worried about race issues. This is a series of questions that were asked of people all over the world, a huge data gathering. What are your attitudes with respect to race? Are you fine with, I don't know, working with people of other races? Are you fine with people of other races living in your neighborhood? Are you fine with your kids dating people of other races and so on? So getting a whole bunch. And basically what you find is the blue areas, most people, and by most people we mean the large majority of people, are not racist. They're fine with working with other races, they're fine with dating other races, they are fine with everything. And of course they still have some races. So we know where the races still are, but at the same time we can congratulate ourselves on the enormous success of the Enlightenment project over the course of the last 2 centuries. And also, let me take a couple more minutes. If we are worried about often a connection between race and poverty, again, 2 centuries. Please go back. 1815. This is 2 centuries of data. This is one of my favorite set of charts of all time. This is every circle is a country around the world. Big circle, big population. Small circle, small. Color-coded by continent. So red is Asia, yellow is Europe, green North America. This is 1850. This is life expectancy at birth, 25 to 40. The longest lived people in the world, that actually is Britain, the first nation of the Enlightenment, with the highest life expectancy. Along the bottom is a measure of income, and it's a log scale, 500, 1,000, then it doubles, 2,000, 4,000, 8,000, right, and so on. And every country in the world is in this quadrant, 1815. America's a young country at that point. Jump 1 century, what has happened in the world? Okay. The green country, that's the United States, went from small and not in first place to big population, people living a lot river and adding 15 to 17 years of life, almost 50% addition in 1 century. Never happened before. We have to pay attention to Canada always, right? Trying to catch up to the US. We're keeping pace. And now, young people, your generation, 2015. Please, there we are. Okay. All right. 200 years ago, every country was in this lower left quadrant. There's no one there anymore. We've taken the whole world, doubled their life expectancy, huge amounts more wealth. So when the postmoderns and the critical theorists say, we are living in a disgusting world, the Enlightenment has failed, modernity has failed, reason has failed, science is a threat, et cetera, right? The data are on our side. So, put them all together. All right, that's the thing. All right, I'm going to stop there. I've only left a couple of minutes for question. As Abby was suggesting, though, I am here for the 3 days, so do feel welcome at any time to have a sit down and we'll talk more about any of the things. But Abby, please.
Yeah, so we're going to take one quick, give a round of applause to Stephen, please. Thank you. Let's take one quick question. We do have a meet and greet with the scholars right before lunch that is going to be out here at the registration table. So you're welcome to meet Stephen there, or he's going to be at lunch. But if we have one quick student question.
We have a question right here.
Okay, we'll go here to a student, Eric.
Yeah, what's your position on the concept of superabundance, techno-optimism, and effective accelerationism?
I'm sorry, secular optimism?
So superabundance, techno-optimism, and effective accelerationism?
Yeah, well, I like the sound of all of those words. The superabundance thesis, I know that one because I read the book by Marian Tupy and Gail Pooley in manuscript. I think I wrote a blurb for it. That's a great book. So I think they're doing wonderful work in documenting the progress that has been made and also doing a very good job at the intellectual history. What's behind the technologies, behind the political freedoms, the religious tolerations, the Industrial Revolution, and the various other follow-up revolutions as well. So I think that's a great book. The latter two I am not as familiar with, but if those are their self-descriptive labels, I'm probably significantly on board with them.
All right, well, that was actually really quick. We'll take one more quick question over here. Isabel, you have someone real quick? There you go.
Okay, thank you. That was really interesting. My question is, at the beginning of the talk, you showed those graphs showing the frequency of different words like racism, sexism, and it seemed like there was like an exponential spike around 2015-ish.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering if there's like some specific event you would attribute that spike to.
I want to say not a specific event. I think the timeline goes like this, that in the 60s and 70s, postmodern high academic theory is strong and dominating in academic departments that are philosophical and closely related to philosophy. So Foucault, Derrida, Lyotard, Richard Rorty, the American, are at their peak. They are very successful at minting, so to speak, a whole new generation of intellectuals who are philosophers, some of them, but many of them taking those themes into English literature, into historiography, and into other academic disciplines, including education schools, law schools, and so on. Such that by the time you get to the 1990s, so this is now one generation, those people are at the peak of their career, and then when you do the the article counts also in the academic journals, it is those ideas and arguments that are predominant. And another important sign is that it's not just in academic journals, but also in textbooks and things that are close to textbooks, like handbooks for aspiring teachers or handbooks for aspiring lawyers. This is what you need to know to be a professional in your field. The handbooks based on those postmodern ideas now applied in the various areas start to become prominent. Now then 1995 then means for the next 20 years there will be another generation of students who are educated and they are graduating and entering into their profession. They will come out of the art schools, they will become the teachers, they will go into journalism and so on. So I think that's why at around 2015, suddenly it's not just in the academic world anymore, it's in the schools, it's in journalism, and then all of us are aware of it. Now, more specifically, I've not done this research, but I do know that at least two of those major newspapers, there were significant ownership changes and replacements of core editorial board functions at two of those newspapers. And my hypothesis is that what happened was that these were people who were kind of critical theory type people or applied postmodern people who now have the editorships at important journalistic outlets, and then many other journalistic outlets are following their lead.
All right, let's give Stephen a big round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Want to see some more Ayn Rand? Hit that subscribe button below, like the video, and I'll see you next time.